Share. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lay. I'm the CVA. I'm the community volunteer ambassador for the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. What that means is I'm under the volunteer program and I oversee volunteerism and community engagement throughout the park. So I'm going to go ahead and do our general consent statement. So as a visible disclosure, we'd like to inform any participants that any and all Zoom series is and will be recorded. The purpose of this is to provide the Zoom series to those who participated or missed out on the session. It is also provided information for participants to refer back to. In addition to the visible disclosure, the statement will be orally stated at the beginning of each Zoom series like I am right now. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it off to our speaker today, Seth Riley.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lay. So just one thing I'll mention at the beginning. So I'm actually going to talk just about mountain lions today. Just decided it was going to be 40 minutes was sort of reasonably short, even just for mountain lions. So but we could do something on bobcats another time, and I could certainly answer questions about bobcats, or we may just do something with me or somebody else on bobcats another time. So I'm going to talk about mountain lions, the work we've been doing over the last 18 years or so on the ecology and conservation of mountain lions here at the park. And I just to introduce myself. So I'm Seth Riley, and I'm the wildlife branch chief here at the park. Been here for 20 years, actually. In January, it was 20 years. And I am also adjunct at UCLA in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And then I'm giving the talk today, but there's tons of other folks involved in all the work we do, mountain lions, but everything else too. But so Jeff Sikich leads all the field work on the mountain lions, and so he's obviously super critical to this project. But as you can see down the bottom here as well, there's lots of other wildlife staff that help with the project, along with tons of interns over the years, and lots of other groups as well. Our GIS folks, we do a ton of public information work on this, admin actually, and then our law enforcement folks too, and then park management, has been supportive all along, which is really critical. And then there are lots of other agencies actually that are critical for all these projects: state parks, MRCA, COSCA locally, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and then we work with Caltrans a lot as well. So it's definitely a big group effort. So I like to start with this slide, which shows some great wildlife habitat in the Santa Monica Mountains at the east end, actually. But you can see downtown Los Angeles in the background. So in all the national parks, right, our goal is to do the best we can to preserve the resources of those parks for future generations. And for us in the wildlife program, that means wildlife in particular. But we have some different challenges at Santa Monica Mountains than you might have at Yellowstone or Yosemite, because we're here in the second largest metropolitan area in the country and one of the largest in the world. And so all of the work that we do on different kinds of wildlife, so we've been studying carnivores like this bobcat here. We do a lot of work with reptiles and amphibians. We're doing some more work with birds, but all of the wildlife projects are generally focused on understanding what are the impacts of urbanization and habitat fragmentation on various wildlife communities. And this may be familiar to some folks, but just to give a little bit of the background. So here's the park boundary. So this dark green line is the administrative boundary of the park here. There's 150,000 acres within that administrative boundary, but actually only about 25,000 of that, so only about a sixth of the land within the administrative boundary is owned by the Park Service. So it's an unusual park in that way, that there's lots of we work with tons of other agencies, as I kind of mentioned before. On this map, the darker green areas are open space, publicly owned open space. So it's actually state parks and MRCA, as I said. But actually about half the land within the administrative boundary is still private, so of course there's intense development pressure on a lot of those remaining areas. So it's complicated jurisdictionally. And then, as I said, we're next to Los Angeles. So this is the Los Angeles basin over here. Here's the Santa Monica Mountains. and they're separated, one thing that I'll definitely talk about, separated from everything to the north by 101, of course. And then there's other sort of major freeways like 118 and other roads, 405, that are important. And then you have areas like this here in the Simi Hills, where we've done a lot of our work on bobcats and coyotes and other things, where you have intense areas of fragmentation, little bits of open space with remaining open space with roads and development in between. So there are places, as hopefully many of you know, like this in the west end of the Santa Monica's, where you can go and have no idea that you're in Los Angeles. But then places like this is in the Simi Hills, where you have these little bits of natural area surrounded by roads and development, and then more bits of open space over here. This is our Rancho Simi and Casca properties here. So, and so we've actually been studying carnivores for the longest. So we've actually been studying carnivores, been studying bobcats now for 25 years. We started with carnivores because they need a huge amount of space. And so if there's a group of animals or of wildlife that's going to be especially vulnerable to habitat loss and fragmentation, carnivores are going to be high on the list. So that's why we started the work. And this is even before I came back in 96 with bobcats and coyotes. And the goal has been to understand, I said it's been about to understand how are these animals making it or not making it in this urbanized landscape. This is a picture of a bobcat actually right down below our office in Thousand Oaks. And in particular, we're studying various aspects of their ecology and behavior, and then looking at how those are related to development. So urban association, by which I mean how much are they using developed areas like this bobcat versus natural areas versus things in between. What are their home ranges like? How are they moving across the landscape? And then a critical thing, of course, in this kind of an urban area is what are corridors for movement, and then what are barriers to movement? How well are they surviving? And then when they don't survive, what are they dying from? What are they eating? And then are they able to disperse, especially with these various barriers? Are they successfully reproducing? And then how are they affected by disease and toxicants? Actually, I'm going to talk about at least a little bit about all of these things relative to mountain lions today. I like to start with this picture because this is a mountain lion and this is not. Seems obvious in this picture, right? But turns out it can be not that easy always to tell, especially a lot of people just don't even know that bobcats are around, actually. I mean, probably that's not true of any of you all, but it turns out people have heard of mountain lions, but they haven't heard of bobcats really, and they see a wild cat out there and they immediately assume it's a mountain lion. So, but you can see the mountain lion has the really long tail here. I mean, they're bigger, of course, and typically they're not spotted, right? This is a nice spotted bobcat, although they can vary a lot. And then the shorter, and then the bobcats have this beautiful facial ruff here, and then their ear tufts, which you can't see right there. So, but we feel like a huge percentage, 90% or something of the sightings that we get of mountain lions turn out to be not to be mountain lions, but some certainly are still. So we've been studying mountain lions not quite as long, since 2002, and we studied them by tracking them with GPS collars, and then we also mark kittens, and for a long time we implanted the kittens and tracked them as well. And actually this is updated through this week. We just marked 2 litters of kittens Monday and Tuesday of this week, and so those were 88, 89, and 90, and 91 and 92. Sorry, just turning my ringer off here. And so, one thing that's interesting to know too is that's not a huge number of animals for 18 years. And that's partly just because, so with bobcats, it's like getting close to 400. So it's partly just because mountain lions are the last large carnivore in the Santa Monicas, and carnivores need a lot of space, but large carnivores need even an order of magnitude more space than things like bobcats and coyotes, right? So for example, female bobcats home range is 1.5 or 2 square kilometers, and a female mountain lion's is like 130 or 40 square kilometers. So they just need a huge amount of space. And so here's a map, again, showing the Santa Monica's, Simi Hills, and Santa Susana's. And our long-term bobcat and coyote studies have been here, largely in the Simi Hills and the northern Santa Monica's around the Liberty Canyon area. This entire map is our is our mountain lion study area, because one of the things we were really interested in from the beginning is, are animals able to get back and forth between the Santa Monica's and these other large natural areas, the Simi Hills, the Santa Susanas, and ultimately Los Padres. So we assume, and I think it's pretty clearly true, that once you get up to Los Padres, you're in a large, basically a source population of mountain lions and other wildlife as well. And so one of the critical things we're trying to do is keep the Santa Monica's effectively connected up to Los Padres. And so we figured, we sort of thought from the beginning that the Santa Monica's by themselves might not be big enough for a viable population of mountain lions, and that is indeed what we've seen. So these are the first 4 mountain lion home ranges for the first 4 mountain lions that we were tracking. And you can see this home range right here. This is P1. And you can see the adult male, he was using the entire Santa Monica's by himself, from Point Mugu State Park out here out to Topanga State Park in the east. And that's not a particularly big home range for an adult male mountain lion. So it just shows you, as big as the Santa Monica's might sometimes seem, that they're just not that big from a mountain lion perspective. This red home range in the middle here, that's P2, the first adult female we were tracking. And one thing that we see is sometimes females will overlap with their daughters or their sisters. And so you can imagine there might be, and then there's some space here because females have generally smaller home ranges, quite a bit smaller in mountain lions, also in bobcats, for example. You can see there's space out here for another female in the west, potentially, and maybe a space here in the east end of the Santa Monica's. And as I said, sometimes the females will overlap with close relatives. So you can imagine maybe there's room for maybe 6 females. And then sometimes we have seen where there might be a couple different males using the Santa Monica's. But either way, you're talking about less than 10 breeding adult animals in the Santa Monica's. There just isn't room for that many, and that's just not enough demographically or genetically for a viable population. And so from the very beginning of the study, we've seen that this connectivity between the Santa Monica's and other areas is really going to be a critical thing. This is what we actually did a big analysis through 2016. These are some more recent home ranges just to give you an idea, again, of what they look like. Here's a couple of males, and you can see, in this case, they don't use the whole Santa Monica's, but they use about half of it. But in general, so adult males are using about 400 square kilometers, which I said is, as I said, is not atypical for mountain lions in general. And then adult female quite a bit less, like less than half or close to a third of that. So on average, about 130. A couple animals I just want to point out here that I'll come back to more in the future. So this is P22 here, who lives in Griffith Park ever since 2012. Our most famous mountain lion, and you can see, and then this is P41 in the Verdugo Mountains here. And their home ranges are, especially for an adult male, right? So adult males are normally averaging close to 400. P22's is 24. And then P41's is also extremely small, 54, but they're completely surrounded by roads and development there over in Los Angeles. So one of the things we're interested in, as I said, for all these carnivores, but including for mountain lions, is how are they using the landscape? And so we did a big analysis recently and looked at, we actually looked at 128,000 GPS points, and we asked, how are they using areas in terms of developed versus natural? And then within the natural areas, how are they using the different habitat types? So this is just an example of P45 out in the western end of the Santa Monica's. So the gray here is developed. The purple here is what we call altered open areas. So those are things that aren't all paved over, but they aren't exactly natural either. So for example, it's agricultural areas out here in the Oxnard Plain. This is Hidden Valley here, but then there's things like the Calabasas landfill, and then golf courses like in North Ranch, and then here's another golf course here. So those are things where you might have like landscaped areas. Cemeteries would be another example. So they're not exactly exactly developed, but not exactly natural either. And then a number of the different habitats, so coastal sage scrub, chaparral, upland woodland, which is like oak woodland, riparian woodland, and then grasslands. And so we're interested to know, how are the mountain lions using the landscape? And in general, and I'll sort of show the data in a second here, but they're very rarely in developed areas themselves, although those, when they are occasionally, those points are potentially of interest. This is a few points from P3 earlier in the North Ranch area here. And you can see most of the time when they're in more developed or close to developed areas, it's during the night. So this point is at 4 in the morning and this point is at 10 at night. Although this point was at 2 in the afternoon. And as far as we know, nobody had any idea, and that's generally the case, that he was there. But the bottom line is, as I said, they are very rarely actually in these urban areas. So this is based on 128,000 points through, actually, I need to adjust it. It was actually through May of 2016. But anyway, 128,300 and something points. And based on 29 animals, there were a few where we looked at them as both adults and subadults. But the critical thing to see here is, so here's with all animals except for 22 and 41, that less than 1% of their points were in urban areas. And actually even altered open areas was very small, 2.6%. And so 96+% of their points are in natural areas. And especially true of adult males and adult females. You can see, like with adult females, 0.1% of their points are in developed areas. The one exception, though, or a couple of exceptions that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, are P22 and P41, these two adult males that were over in Los Angeles. And you can see for them, here 7.5% of the points were in developed areas and 3.3% in altered open. But even for those two, 90% of their points were still natural. So even those two are really focused on the natural areas. And then this is just the same thing, but looking at their home ranges. So we computed home ranges and then said what percentage of their home range are urban or altered or natural. And then basically the same story, a little bit higher, but still a tiny percentage of their home ranges. So for all animals, on average, 1.8% of their home ranges were urban and 91% natural. But again, 22 and 41, a little bit higher, or quite a bit higher, 17.4% of their home ranges were urban. And so about a quarter of their home ranges were either urban or these altered open areas. So the other thing that we did, though, so that was just looking at where are the points and what is their home range made up of. But we did another analysis called resource selection. And what we do with resource selection is we ask what's available to these animals and then what are they using. And so we're saying what parts of the landscape are they actually using more than they're available. And this is a distance-based analysis. So what we do is we take all the GPS locations for the different animals, and then we take the same number of random points within their home range, and we measure the distances, say to urban or to chaparral or something. And we see, are the distances farther for their points than the random points? And if they're farther, that means they're avoiding that thing, right? They're not selecting it. And then if they're closer, that means they're selecting it. And so just the way the analysis works, the negative numbers means they're selecting it because the distances are actually closer for their points. And so this is just an example for adult males, but you can see they're strongly, so these beta values are an indicator of how much they're selecting or avoiding. And so they're very strongly selecting chaparral and strongly selecting like the oak woodland and then avoiding the grassland areas. So the interesting thing about the resource selection analysis, though, is we saw kind of the opposite thing. So as I said, the mountain lions are almost never actually in urban areas, but they did strongly select them in this distance analysis. In other words, their points were significantly closer to urban areas than you would expect based on chance. And this is true for all 4 age sex classes. But on the contrary, they actually avoided the altered open areas. So these things like landscape parks and cemeteries and golf courses and things. So that was sort of an interesting thing to see. And this is kind of what that looks like. So here's a bunch of points for P42 out in the eastern end of the Santa Monicas. And you can see she's basically never actually in the developed areas or these altered open areas, but she has a lot of points. This is in the Palisades Highlands area, for example, where she's very close to those developed areas. And we have some thoughts about, why that may be. We think it might be related to the fact that deer might be attracted to developed areas, and so that might be a reason why the mountain lions are using them. These are the points for P22 here, and you can see he is, so these altered open areas. So this is the Forest Lawn Cemetery here. This is the landfill. This is a golf course here, and another one down here. This is the LA Zoo, and you can see he's basically never in. So here at Forest Lawn, you can see he has a bunch of points in the little stream corridor that goes through it, but he's basically never actually out on the cemetery itself. And so these altered open areas seem to really be avoided by the mountain lions, which is interesting. One of the things that we saw with this analysis too is that P22 and P41 were really interesting and exceptions in this way too. And they were different across the day. So we looked at what were they doing during the day, what were they doing at crepuscular time, so in the evening and early in the morning, and then what were they doing at night. And so these are these selection coefficients for development. And you can see how they're very different. So remember, if it's positive, that means they're avoiding it. And if it's negative, like this one, it means they're selecting it. And so P22 was very strongly avoiding development during the day and at crepuscular times. But at night, this is not significantly different from zero. He was neither selecting it nor avoiding it. Whereas P41, again, strongly avoiding those urban areas during the day, but selecting them at crepuscular times and strongly selecting them at night. And so these two most urban animals were showing a big difference in how they reacted to development across different times of the day. And so here's P22's points again, and you can see a bunch of his points that are in the urban areas here to the southwest of Griffith Park. But one interesting thing is these two animals seem to be doing it a little bit differently. So if you zoom in here, you can see some of these points and what's going on in this area. And many of you may know there's houses up on the ridge lines, and then there's natural or at least vegetated areas out down in the middle, down in these canyons. And so that's where his points seem to be if you zoom in even more, right? So this is overall, but there are these little natural or vegetated canyons, which is where the points were typically for P22. But P41 was interesting. So here's P41's points in the Verdugo Mountains, and you can see here his points right in Burbank, and these are very different. These are really urban areas. And when he was out in those, it was always in the middle of the night, 2 a.m., 4 a.m., etc. But it just was kind of interesting. Again, most of his points are in the natural areas, but he was making these forays out into really developed areas. And then this is what that looks like, the aerial in the background. So you can see some of these points, some of them are in these sort of more vegetated areas, but some of these ones out here in Burbank are really intensely urban. And this is actually, some people got some remote camera video and photos of P41 in a few of these instances. So that's him there with a domestic cat actually, and here with a raccoon. And here he is walking on someone's back patio. So we're just not even sure what he's up to, but probably looking for various kinds of smaller prey out in those urban areas. So a critical thing, of course, as I've been saying from the beginning with the mountain lions, is how well are they able to move back and forth between these large natural areas, and in particular, are they able to move back and forth across freeways, and in particular, like 118 and 101. And so we have actually seen quite a bit of movement across 118. So this is a couple of animals from early in the study, P3 and P4. And we do have natural habitat on both sides in the Santa Susana Pass area. And both of those animals went back and forth. And in fact, P3 made 14 different trips back and forth across 118, so 7 round trips. And we think, but the one thing that's true about that, not only is there natural habitat on both sides in that area, but also there's this nice big hiker equestrian tunnel. This is at Corriganville. There you can see P3 with a remote camera photo with the graffiti on the bottom there and his collar there. So we know that he used this tunnel, for example, in this case, And we think he probably, once he figured that out, he used it every time. So we did see crossing of 118, but the other freeways, we've seen very little crossing. So this is some points from P2, that first adult female that we were tracking early in the study. And here you can see she came up close, and this is in the Liberty Canyon area, close to the freeway. This is at night, so 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night, and then she turned around and went the other way. And this is what that would have looked like from where she was standing there. And you can see, and I'll come back to a little bit later about that we're working on trying to get a crossing here. But at the moment, there's natural area here, there's a Gurr Road, but unfortunately to get down and sort of safely across the freeway, she'd have to navigate behind this office building and then cross under Liberty Canyon Road. And basically we're seeing that they're not doing that. And so this is what that looks like more broadly. So this is thousands of points throughout the Santa Monica's. And you can see here at the west end of the Santa Monica's, lots of different mountain lions coming right up to the freeway, but not crossing. Same thing in the central Santa Monica's here. And then actually this is at the eastern end along the San Fernando Valley. And you can see there's so much development there that often they just don't even get close to the freeway to be able to get back and forth across. So very little movement. And this is actually true. You can see here along 405 here, lots of animals going right up to it and not crossing. But the fact that we're not having animals crossing 101 leads to a number of issues. So the fact that there's very low dispersal out of the Santa Monica's leads to increased interactions between young animals and adult males. So typically in a mountain lion population, all the young males will disperse out somewhere else to find their own, able to set up a territory. And actually even half the young females, I was saying sometimes females will stay and overlap with their close relatives, but half of them will try to disperse as well. And because there's very little dispersal out of the Santa Monica's, we see a couple things, which I'll just talk about in a little bit more detail. One, we see that the males run into each other, in particular young males running into adult males, leading to fights that can be fatal. And then with the females, can lead to very close mating events with very close relatives. And then the other big issue, and we've just had a couple of exceptions, one of which I'll talk about, but very little dispersed to the Santa Monica's. And so together with the fact that the population is very small, as I said at the beginning, and with the fact that you have some of this inbreeding, as I was just saying, it leads to very low genetic diversity in the Santa Monica's. So just to talk a little bit more about these challenges. So in terms of dispersal of young mountain lions, especially males. So we know of 23 young males in the Santa Monica's since 2002, and not one of them has successfully dispersed to a new home range outside the Santa Monica's. I mean, we had a couple that almost did. We had one that made it all the way across multiple freeways up to Los Padres, and then he got hit on 5. And then we have P22, who made it out of the Santa Monica's, but then he got to Griffith Park, where he's by himself, we're very sure. And so not a successful home range in terms of being able to breed. These young males, we don't know for sure what happened to them, but of 18 where we do know what happened, 14 of them died before or during dispersal, a number of them on roads. This is a young male actually that we weren't tracking that we found out about that was killed in Santa Monica right off the promenade. But the most common source of mortality, especially for young animals, especially young males, is these conflicts they have with other mountain lions. So in particular, they fight with adult males. And so that's a major source of mortality, as I said, especially for subadults. And then actually we just completed a study of survival and mortality causes all. And of the 20 deaths of known cause, we had 6 were from other mountain lions, and then 6 from vehicles, and then 6 from rodenticide poisoning, which is something I'll talk about a little bit more, and then a couple from poaching. This is what it looks like in terms of dispersal, what it's sort of supposed to look like, right? So here you have a young male. This is P16, who was living in the eastern end of the Santa Susana Mountains. He actually was overlapping with his father, an adult male, and they seem to sometimes 21, the adult was sometimes chasing him around a little, but he eventually dispersed out along 126. He crossed 126 over here between Ventura and Santa Paula, went way up here into Los Padres, and then settled here in the Lake Piru area. But the problem is, if animals, like I said, are not able to disperse out of the Santa Monicas, then they're not able to do that kind of thing. From this recent study that we did of mortality causes, just here, it was interesting. So as I said, this issue of mountain lions killing each other is much more of an issue with subadults. So they are 12 times more likely to die from these fights with other mountain lions, whereas adults are much more likely to die from various human-related causes like rodenticide poisoning or being hit by cars. And then the other thing, as I mentioned a little bit before, is we're having these these mating events between very close relatives. So this is one of the first litters of kittens that we found, or was the first litter back in 2004, P5, 6, 7, and 8. The parents were P1 and P2, but then we know that later P1 mated with P6, his daughter, and had P13. And then later on, P12 mated with P13 and had this litter of kittens, 17, 18, and 19. But then P12 ended up mating with his daughter, P19. They had P23 and 24. And then you can see here, P12 ended up mating with P23, his granddaughter. And so actually for these two, P36 and 37, P12 was the father, the grandfather, and the great-grandfather. And, you know, they don't know that, we think. There's no indication, because the males just, they don't have anything to do with the kittens. They're just out there trying to run into whatever females they can. But because animals aren't able to disperse back and forth, then animals end up running into their close relatives. And so all of that is not good from a genetic diversity point of view. And this actually, let me just I'll go here first. So what we've basically seen with work that we've done together with UCLA and the University of Wyoming is significantly reduced genetic diversity for mountain lions in the Santa Monicas south of 101. So these are a number of different measures of genetic diversity, heterozygosity, and this is a number of alleles or different sort of types of the different genes. And then this is how many of them are different. And you can see in the north, the levels are much higher than in the south. And in fact, overall, the Santa Monicas, and we've looked together with other folks throughout the state, Santa Monicas have the lowest genetic diversity, and it's actually similar to the Santa Anas. Those two have the lowest genetic diversity of any population that's been measured in California, and actually lower than all other populations measured throughout the West. The only place that they've had lower genetic diversity is actually in Florida panthers. And in Florida panthers, they almost went extinct back in the early 90s because of these genetic diversity issues. So one thing that another thing that we did with the genetic data is we did this analysis called structure, where it asks, where do you see different population clusters? Basically, you put all the genetic data and you say into the program, and you say how many different genetic clusters are there. And so these are all the animals in the Santa Monicas in this green cluster, and they're very strongly in this particular green cluster, you can see. And then north of the Santa Monicas are this blue one, and then actually east of 5 are this red cluster. So we're seeing some pretty strong differences. We don't have as many animals over there to analyze, but relative to that freeway as well. So significant issues in terms of genetic diversity and significant genetic differentiation between the Santa Monicas and animals north of 101 and east of 5. So that's kind of the bad news, but we did have an animal that we collared. So this is the first sort of 10, 11 animals, and you can see they were all either south of 101 or north of 101, but we caught this young male P12 in the Simi Hills in late 2008. And early 2009, he crossed 101 here, and he actually crossed right in the Liberty Canyon area. So this was a point here at 1 a.m., and then this is a point here at 3 a.m. And so he crossed, and that was great. But the critical thing is, not only did he cross, but then he survived, right? I was saying, obviously, these subadult males often get in fights with adults and may not survive, et cetera. He actually survived and started breeding. And so that was good news because he brought in new genetic material. So this is P12 here, this animal in the blue cluster right here. and he mated with P13, who was very strongly in this green cluster from the Santa Monicas. And these are their offspring here. And you can see they're a nice mix between the green cluster from south of 101 and the blue cluster from north of it. They're about half and half. And then these two animals here, this is P23 and P24. Those are the two where P12 is the father and the grandfather. And you can see they're about 3/4 associated with that blue cluster from P12. So he brought in new genetic material, but as I said, he also then started mating with, with his daughters and granddaughters, and so that's not ideal in the long run from a genetic point of view. This is some work that we did actually with a colleague, John Benson, now at the University of Nebraska, but he was a postdoc with us at UCLA, and he modeled the population, did simulation modeling for the mountain lions in the Santa Monicas, looking at how likely is the population to survive, and then looking at their genetic diversity. And one of the things that was cool about the simulation modeling is he could look at a number of different scenarios, right, and say, what is genetic diversity? So here's heterozygosity, which is one of those measures of genetic diversity. How does that look over 50 years if we do a simulation over 50 years? And you can see this is with no immigration, and genetic diversity continues to decline pretty steadily. With the 1 per 12 years, which is what we were seeing with P12, it also declines, not quite as much, but still pretty solidly declining. But if you just increase the amount of immigration just a little bit, like 1 per 4 years or even 1 per 2 years, you can see that it declines much less, and it even remains fairly steady. And actually this red line here, we stuck that in there because that's the level of genetic diversity of heterozygosity that they were seeing in Florida when they were having those serious inbreeding issues, and it was on the way to extinction. And so the point here is that you don't need a ton of mountain lions parading back and forth across the freeway to make quite a big difference genetically in the long run. And so actually that's a critical thing that we are working on, and many of you may know, we are working with a number of partners to try to get a wildlife crossing over 101, so it would be a big, wide, vegetated overpass. And this is a couple of examples in a couple of other places. So this is our crossings, very famous crossings at Banff National Park in Canada, and this is one in Germany. And this is, so if we were all together, and I would say, sort of, what do you notice about these situations, right? Well, two things. One is there's no cars on the road, right? So nothing like the kind of traffic that we see in Southern California. And also, you can see there's only 3 lanes here, and in this case, 4 lanes here that these are crossing. And so that's some of the challenges that we have with our crossing here, right, is that it would actually be over 10 lanes of roadway. This is in the Liberty Canyon area here, 8 lanes of traffic. So no one, as far as we know, anywhere in the world has tried to put one over such a big crossing, and no one has tried to put one in such an urban area as well. So it's a challenging project, but we are farther along than we've ever been before. We're actually in the final design phase. There's lots of different partners, of course. Caltrans, because it's their road. But a critical one is the National Wildlife Federation, who are actually doing the fundraising to try to raise funds for that project. So it's actually about 12:45. I don't know, Sarah and Leigh and Riza, what you want to do. Should I go for another 5 minutes or so, or do we want to start taking questions? Do you guys have a thought? Or
well, if you want to do another 5 minutes, I only have 2 questions in the chat room so far. But
okay.
If you want to do another 5 minutes, and then we can take questions.
Okay, that sounds good. I'll do that. I'll just mention quickly, this is a really interesting animal, P64, that figured out how to get back and forth across 101 by using this tunnel here. This is a number of different remote camera photos that Jeff got. These are a couple of tunnels that go across underneath 101. There you can see, there he is near the north end. There's a truck there. And I mean, it shows how adaptable these animals are, that he even figured out how to use these tunnels. So they're very long and they bend in the middle, and so you can't actually even see through them. And so he figured out how to use them, and he started going back and forth a whole bunch. But they're not good crossings in general because no other animals are using them. We've been monitoring them with cameras, like a few raccoons and a couple skunks, and that's basically it. So it's been pretty interesting. I mean, this guy, so there he is coming out the other side there. He actually made 14 different crossings of 101, and actually he figured out how to cross potentially through Corriganville. We didn't have a camera there, but he crossed 118 a whole bunch as well. So he was a pretty interesting animal. Unfortunately, in the end, I think I won't have time to talk about it, but he ended up dying after the Woolsey fire. But it shows you they're able to find various things like that, but the crossing needs to be suitable for lots of animals to use it. So just one other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was a little bit about mortality, and in particular, I mentioned this a little bit before, but we've seen a lot of mortality in mountain lions, specifically from rodenticide poisoning. And so what happens is people put out these rodenticides, specifically these anticoagulants, to kill rodents. So this is a picture of what happens. This is a coyote, and this is not where he was found. Like, we found him out in the middle of the park. He was just laying there dead. You can see he's a nice, big, healthy animal. And when we opened him up, he had bled to death internally. And that's what we've seen. It's been a major source of mortality in coyotes, but we've actually seen it in the mountain lions as well. I don't have time to talk about it too much, but one thing, the first couple of mountain lions that died of the rodenticide poisoning also had mange disease, which is a major issue in the bobcat population, where when they're exposed to rodenticides, they're much more likely to get mange and then die from the mange. But the two mountain lions actually died from the bleeding to death, like the coyotes. We were a little surprised to see so much rodenticide exposure in mountain lions, just because most of what they kill is deer, and those things are not showing up in the deer. But the second most common thing that we see mountain lions killing is coyotes. And from our testing, we've seen 85% of the coyotes that are tested are exposed to these rodenticides. And this is those first two animals, P3 and P4. And these black points here are coyote kills they made. And they both made coyote kills within the last month before they died. And so what looks like is happening is the rodenticides get into the smaller animals, and then they get into the carnivores like coyotes or raccoons or bobcats. And then we think the mountain lions are likely, I mean, maybe they're sometimes eating squirrels or other things, but mostly probably getting them directly from these other carnivores. And this is a number of the compounds here. And this is the what we saw through 2015. Basically every single mountain lion, with one exception here, P5, was exposed to these compounds, and generally multiple different ones. And even this young 3-month-old kitten here, P17, had been exposed even at 3 months. But the interesting thing is we're still continuing to see a lot of exposure. So some of you may know that the state law changed in 2014, but we've had a number of mortalities in recent years. So actually P41, that one that lived out in the Verdugos, he died in 2017. Then P64, who actually died because of the fire, but we tested him. And then P47, an adult male. All of them were actually exposed to 6 different rodenticide compounds. And then P47 actually died from the bleeding to death. That's a picture of P47 there. And then even more recently, we had another couple of animals, P53, and then this is just this last summer, and then P30, another big adult male who died directly from the coagulopathy. He actually had 5 liters of free blood in his abdomen. So overall, 96% of the bobcats that we've tested have been exposed to these rodenticides. Let me just go, well, let's see. I'll just mention, I'll just quickly say that the Woolsey fire, of course, all of you know, was a huge impact. And that's something that we're really interested in studying right now, and looking at the impacts on all kinds of wildlife, but in particular on the mountain lions. So you can see here's the Woolsey fire here. It burned close to half of the Santa Monicas and more like 2/3 of the Simi Hills. So it really had a huge impact, and burned pretty intensively. So we had a couple of animals that actually died as a result of the fire. So P74 we think was actually killed in the fire himself, in the fire itself. So we lost contact with him right around the time the fire came through, and we never found him. But we think his collar, just this is what that area looked like the next day. That his collar just got destroyed. There was a deer right in that same area. And then P64, unfortunately, was pretty interesting in terms of, but unfortunate. So he seemed to escape. He escaped the fire itself, but he ran into developed areas. He was up in the Simi Hills when the fire came through, and he turned around and went back up into the area that had just burned. And then he ended up dying a couple weeks later, and basically he starved to death because he was unable to hunt. So these are his paws that got burned when he went back over the recently burned area, and then he just wasn't able to hunt after that. So most of the mountain lions, actually, they're big and mobile and they do escape the fire, but we did have these 2 animals that did not. But the other interesting thing that, we're sort of looking at since then is how are they using the landscape post-fire? So these are the mountain lions that we were following for the 6 months before the fire, and you can see they're all throughout the Santa Monicas here. But this is the same animals, and we lost a couple, as I said, but then you can see this is post-fire, and you can see they're way less use, especially right in the middle of the Santa Monicas here in that fire. And we're still seeing quite a bit of that. I'll just jump forward to this picture here. So this is more than a year after the fire. And well, I guess it's about 10 months after the fire. And you can see here's a number of males, and you can see they're really almost never using the main part of the burn area. And one thing that we think may have occurred too is that squeezes some of these animals into smaller areas. This is just the males. You can see this is P56 that was at the west end here. And then we had 3 different males here in the east end, and these green points is P61. He ended up actually crossing 405 and then getting chased by a male that was on the other side of the freeway and getting hit and killed on 405. And so we think maybe, again, when they're squeezed into these smaller areas, that could increase the social interactions and potentially cause issues. So, all right, so I'll stop there. If we wanted to have people ask questions or whatever you think.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions now in the chat box.
Okay.
So I'll just go through them.
So should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, you can stop sharing. Okay, the first one is, how often is a point transmitted?
Right, so that's an excellent question. So we can program the callers to do whatever we want, basically, not whatever we want, but we have a lot of leeway there. And so what we do is, but it's a huge trade-off between how many points do you get and how long does the collar last before the battery dies, right? So currently the way we have it, they'll last 2 or even sometimes maybe 3 years because, then once the battery's dying, we have to go out and recapture the animal, and that's a lot of work and it's more stress for the animal. So that's a balance there. And so what we currently do is we currently get 8 locations per day. So we get 1 in the middle of the day. Right now it's at 2 p.m. And then we get 7 locations every 2 hours at night. So we get 1 at 6, 8, 10, 12, 2, 4, and then 6 a.m. So that's what we're doing currently. But there have been times where we've cranked it up to get more locations for various reasons. Like recently we've been looking at a number of females to see if they have kittens. And actually one of the things, I didn't have time to talk about it, but we were kind of interested to see are animals potentially doing anything different during the pandemic, when people weren't using parks as much, that kind of thing. And so like we cranked up a few animals that we had. Some of the callers we can actually remotely tell them to change their schedule through the satellites, which is kind of amazing. And so we actually changed it to get points like every hour during the day for some of these animals. So anyway, so it's variable, like I said, it's this balance. Like it'd be great to get, like tons of data all the time, but then the collar would not last nearly as long. So.
Cool, thanks. The next question is, you talked a little bit about your work with UCLA and the University of Wyoming. Are you also collaborating with UC Davis team, Vickers and Boyce, who have done or are doing similar studies in San Diego and Orange County?
Right. Yes, we definitely do. I mean, it depends a little bit on what you mean by sort of collaborate, but yeah, we know those folks well, and we often see them at conferences and stuff. And actually, for example, I didn't really talk about it, but we work together with the folks at the University of Wyoming to do mountain lion genetics across the whole state of California. And so they used our samples, and they used Winston and Walter's samples from down there, and a bunch of other places from all over the state. So yeah, and then as I said, that population is especially interesting because, or especially relevant to ours, because they've studied them in a few different places, but they've studied them in the Santa Anas for a long time, and that population is also totally isolated by roads and development. And as I said, together with ours, those two populations are the lowest genetic diversity that anyone's ever measured. And so actually we did a whole project together with Winston and other folks, the Nature Conservancy, to try to figure out where's the best place to put a crossing, both for our population, and Liberty Canyon turned out to be the best spot. I mean, to some extent, there just aren't very many options left, but we did the same thing down at the Santa Ana. So we all got together and we brought in some outside experts actually that have studied the crossings in Banff actually, and then other mountain lion populations, to say where is the best place to try to put a crossing over 15, which would connect the Santa Anas to other natural areas to the east. So, the goal is, I mean, we're really hoping to get this crossing in our area, but the goal is to have increased connectivity, not just in one place, but throughout the state, and more broadly than that even. And I've been talking about mountain lions today, and we want to, of course, increase connectivity for them. They're one of probably the populations that most at risk because there's so few of them. But really, we're trying to connect these natural areas for all species, not just for mountain lions. But anyway, so yes, the answer is yes. We definitely work with Walter and Winston and other folks as well. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting you talk about working with them and getting that overpass built, because the next question is, what organization should we donate to in support of the wildlife corridor? I know Samo Fund has been collecting money for the wildlife corridor, but can you suggest other organizations that are helping collecting funds?
Yeah. And so, as I mentioned, the main one that's raising the funds for the crossing is the National Wildlife Federation. But yeah, Samo Fund is also great, of course, and we work very closely with them. So either of those two, would be absolutely the right ones in terms of supporting the crossing and our research, actually. Yeah.
Great. Next question, because we talked last week, I think it was, or 2 weeks ago, all the weeks are kind of blending together, about the coyote scat program.
Yeah.
Have you ever run fecal tests to determine mountain lion food preferences in the different habitat types?
Right, that's an excellent question. And the answer is no, we have not done it with scat the same way we did with coyotes, and we've done it with bobcats actually. We have done diet work, and I just didn't have time to include it today, but we have done diet work with mountain lions. But the way we do it with mountain lions is we actually look for their kill sites. And so what we do is we look at the data points, and we see when the animal has been going back to the same spot over and over again. And when they've gone back for at least 24 hours, then we can go in and see what they killed. In fact, we just did that this morning. So this one female that we're tracking, who has young kittens, she made a fawn kill just a couple nights ago, and so that's a good thing, because she needs her energy right now. But anyway, so that's that's how we do it with mountain lions is, and I did show that one slide that showed where those coyote kills were for P3 and P4. We go in and we actually look for the kills themselves, and we've done that. I forget what the number is now. It's, I don't know, 550 or something, different places. But it's a good question because it would be nice. So that gives us a good idea of when they kill something big, right? So we only find a kill site typically if they've been there for at least 24 hours. But if they eat a ground squirrel or a rabbit or something smaller, they're not going to be there for 24 hours. And so we're not going to find out about that. And so it would be great actually if we could do scat analysis on mountain lions. And basically the problem is we never find mountain lion scat. And like you go out there and you walk around, I'm sure you all know, you can see coyote scat, you can see bobcat scat on the trails like all the time. We basically virtually never find mountain lion scat. And then the one place that we do find it is when we go to a kill site, and then there'll be a big pile of scat there, but you know that that's all from that kill, you know what I mean? So, and so the bottom line is it's just not been something we've been able to do. Although I will say, we're working with California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They're trying to figure out sort of how many mountain lions and in what habitats are there across the whole state, or can we figure that out? And one of the ways they're doing that is by using scat detection dogs. So these are these dogs that can identify scat from different species. And so they actually were planning to come do that. It'll be cool to do it in our area because we have a good idea of how many animals there are out there because we're radio tracking them. And then they can see, okay, how many animals do we detect with the scat detection? Basically you collect the scat and then you genotype the scat and figure out which animal it came from. But anyway, they were actually all set to come literally like the week that the fire happened, and then the fire like just totally sort of burned the park down. So, but we still plan to do that with them. And so that will be a way that we might be able to, you know, collect a bunch of mountain lion scat that we don't typically find. So, but yeah, that's a good question.
Cool. Few more questions.
Yeah.
Have mountain lions ever been kept in captivity like in a zoo? I know that when I was in college, way back when, I actually worked with a pair of mountain lions that were confiscated. Somebody had them in their home in Massachusetts.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, and so they brought them to the zoo in Massachusetts, and so we worked with them there, but I have to admit I haven't seen many mountain lions in zoos, but I'm sure that that's fairly common.
Yeah, so they can be in zoos. So the Oakland Zoo has some. I don't think the LA Zoo does currently, although I think they would be willing to. There's a mountain lion, just found out actually recently, there's a mountain lion at the Sonoran Desert Museum in Tucson. So the answer is yes, they are sometimes at zoos. And then sort of just a related bit of information. So you cannot legally do rehab. So wildlife rehabilitators will take in animals that are injured or sick or whatever and nurse them back to health and then typically release them back into the wild. You cannot do that with mountain lions. You can do it with bobcats and coyotes and other things, but it's not legal. The idea being that they could become too habituated to people and then that could be an issue. So, but that is a challenge. Like if you come across, there was a couple of mountain lion kittens that were found underneath a car in the Burbank area. Actually, this was, I don't know, a decade ago or something, but they were rescued. And actually initially they went to the California Wildlife Center, but they couldn't go back to the wild. So they had to find a place for them. So in that case, I forget where they went, but there are some places that have captive mountain lions. Yeah.
Okay. Here's an interesting one. Can you talk about trapping and relocating mountain lions to ensure more diversity?
Right. Yeah. So that's an excellent question. that we get a lot is why not just, move animals across the freeway to increase the genetic diversity in the Santa Monicas. And what I always say is that's certainly something, that we would consider. I mean, I'll probably, be long gone at that point, but if we're not able, so our preference is not to have to do that, right? Our preference is to just increase connectivity naturally. And as I said, it's not just for the mountain lions, it's for everything, but our preference is to build the crossing. Ideally, we'd have multiple crossings. Maybe we could get one out at the west end along the Caneva Grade, say, or maybe a tunnel or something to increase connectivity so that the animals are moving back and forth on their own and we don't have to be that hands-on. But what I always say is if it's 10 years from now and genetic diversity has continued to decline and we haven't been able to increase connectivity or increase it enough, then I think we certainly should consider that. It wouldn't be up to me, or not just up to me. I mean, the other reason why it's not preferable is it doesn't typically work very well to move wildlife around. They don't survive very well afterwards. It's not like there's a bunch of sort of not good mountain lion habitat out there that doesn't have mountain lions, right? Basically, if there's habitat, they're already there. And so if you're moving animals, you're putting them into the territory for animals that already live there, right? And so, again, you'll have these fights and they can kill each other and et cetera. So it just doesn't work that well. That being said, it did work extremely well. I didn't really talk about this, but in Florida, where the mountain lions, they're called Florida panthers, there were almost extinct or on the way to extinction. They brought in 8 female mountain lions from Texas, 5 of which bred, and it totally turned that population around. It went from 25 to close to 200 now, and all these inbreeding depression issues, they had a bunch of defects and things, those basically went away. So it can work, and I would say we would certainly consider it, if we had to. Like I said, our preference is not to do that. It's also expensive and time consuming to, sort of be catching animals and moving them around and et cetera. But I definitely think that's something we should consider if we get to a point where we're not, it's continuing to be a bad situation.
So what would you recommend if somebody wanted to do volunteer work with park biologists and wildlife studies?
That's a good question. So, one of the issues for us, it sort of depends on what kinds of things could be done. One of the challenges for us is a lot of the work that we do sort of requires coming, sort of on a very regular basis over a very long time, you know what I mean? And so it's something which is something that it's hard for lots of folks to necessarily do, right? But that's kind of the thing that we need. So for example, we have an internship program, as you well know, Sarah. And those interns come full time for 6 months, because it takes a bunch of time and energy and effort to sort of have them get up to speed on the kinds of things that we need to do. That being said, there are certainly lots of programs. So I guess Justin talked about the SCAT project, that was like entirely volunteer based, basically. So the volunteers were actually collecting the SCAT and analyzing the SCAT. And then another, I don't know if did Justin talk about his camera projects at all too, or no?
Actually, Felipe talked about the wildlife camera project.
Okay, right. So that's another. So we use cameras a ton. I mean, we have this LA River Urban Wildlife Information Network project, but we use them. I didn't really talk about it, but we do a whole ton of projects together with Caltrans, where we use cameras to monitor different crossing points along the freeway. And so bottom line is we generate a ton of photos from all kinds of projects, and we can definitely use help. And one thing that's sort of good about that is that people don't necessarily even have to like come in somewhere to be able to assist with some of that. So Tori, were you wanting to say something about that, or no? Okay.
So no, I mean, it would be great. The assistance would be great in going through the photos, and we did talk about that a bit. There's just all the issues about people using their own devices and not being on network, and how do we do that safely and all that
Right.
stuff. So we're still working through that, but we'd love a count. If any of you are interested in that,
Yeah.
going through photos, send me an email and maybe I'll keep a list until we have it figured out.
Yeah, as I said, we have lots of different projects. We're actually just starting. I don't know if anyone has talked about it, but we're actually just starting, and actually we're using a bunch of volunteers for that too, actually. This project where we're putting out 180 different sites for cameras to look at the impacts of the fire, long-term impacts of the Woolsey fire. So we have sites throughout the Santa Monica's and the Simi Hills. And so we're going to be generating thousands and thousands of photos. And then actually we're using volunteers to help us. We have 60 cameras for 180 sites. And so every month we're moving those cameras, from one site to the next. So that's another project that we're definitely using volunteers on.
Okay, great. So lots of volunteer opportunities out there. We do have a few more questions if you have some time.
Sure, that's fine. I can go a little longer.
Okay. So here's some questions about the future. What might adaptation to urban areas look like in 20 years? And why are there attacks in Orange County, but not necessarily up in our area?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, those are two very different questions. But
Yeah.
but yeah. So the first one, I mean, that's I guess I don't really have an answer other than we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, I think that's really interesting to think about. I mean, and that question gets a little bit into sort of evolution and selection. Like, are we going to start to see actual changes in, in morphology or in behavior in various species? And it is something that people have started to study in urban areas. Like they've seen differences in bird song, for example, in more urban areas. But it's just a very hard thing to study. I mean, I think one thing that seems to be true, fortunately, and this gets a little bit towards the other question too, is that mountain lions seem to be able to relatively well, from what we've seen, right? We still have mountain lions here in Los Angeles. I don't like to use the word adapt because that implies that evolution has occurred, and we typically don't really know that it has yet. But they are been able to persist, let's say, even in this very urban area, in this very urban landscape. And I think that's a good sign. And actually, I didn't had a slide potentially at the end that gets to it, but there's a few things that are critical for that to be the case, right? One is, there's not enough habitat just in the Santa Monica, so that's why it's critical to connect them to other areas, right? But the habitat that we do have in the Santa Monica seems to be good, right? So they're reproducing, they're surviving pretty well. I mean, subadults a little not quite as well, but they're not, and the dispersing is an issue. But in the Santa Monicas, they seem to be finding enough deer to eat and reproducing, et cetera. The other thing that's critical, though, is that they are generally not, fortunately, getting into negative interactions with humans. And so, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're generally attacking people in Orange County. There was that one attack in 2004, which was, a horrible sort of tragic event, obviously, where the mountain biker was killed, and then the other woman was attacked afterwards. But that, and attacks have occurred in a few other places, right? I mean, there was one up in Washington, I forget, last year or something. They do happen, but it's a tiny number. It's like 20 or 20 some or something in the last 100 years. I mean, it's like, so it's very clear that mountain lions typically do not think of people as prey. I mean, if they did, all the mountain lions we've been studying, right, have interacted with people, and probably a lot of them like on a virtually daily basis, like P22. So if they thought about people as prey generally, there would be no mountain lions left anywhere in the West where there's urban areas, because they all would have attacked someone and then they all would have been removed. And so fortunately, that's not the case. I mean, we, knock on wood, we have studied now 92 mountain lions over the last 18 years, and none of them have ever behaved aggressively towards people, and unfortunately, like I said, these situations, when it does occur, are so weird and anomalous. We just don't really know what the reason is. But fortunately, that's not something that mountain lions normally do, if that makes sense.
We have a question about, you talked a little bit about rodenticides. There is a chemical that's been released. It's rat birth control, Contrapest by, not sure who that company is, Sensitech, I think
Sensitech, yeah.
Yeah. It's been approved in 47 states, but for application by homeowners. But California, it can only be used by IPM certified companies.
Yeah.
Currently, there's only one vendor in the LA area. And so they're asking what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, and I just actually don't know a whole lot about it. I've heard people give talks at conferences about it. I mean, and it seems like, if so many states have already, approved it, I assume that means, it's reasonably effective. I mean, it seems like certainly a good strategy to just stop rodents. Rodents are notorious for being very good reproducers, right? And so if you could have an impact on that, unfortunately, you always sort of wonder, like, what are the potential impacts on these things if they get out into the natural environment, and I don't know how well that's been evaluated, and so I just don't know a whole lot about it, but it does seem like an interesting thing to try. I mean, it definitely is not going to have the same kind of impacts as these anticoagulants, probably up the food chain, but I don't know, like, if it gets out into rodents in the park and then carnivores are picking them up, have people evaluated whether that's going to have an effect? I just don't know. So
Okay. And speaking about food chain and food, somebody asked, is hunting food source one of the reasons why mountain lion would venture into an urban area like P22 or the Verdugo Hills lion would venture into those places? Or would there be other reasons other than food that would bring mountain lions into urban settings?
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, the answer is we don't typically really know for sure. I mean, it does seem like from those photos I showed of P41, it does seem like he was out hunting, cats and raccoons and other things. And people in other parts of the West, so the Santa Cruz Mountains in Northern California and the front range of Colorado, so from like Fort Collins down through Denver to Colorado Springs, they have seen that mountain lions are taking some of those smaller species like domestic cats or raccoons. Those areas are not nearly as densely urban as our area. Certainly nothing like those places where P41 was. So we assume that that's probably what they're doing is hunting. The other reason that we think it's likely that animals are sometimes in more developed areas is because it might be a young animal that's trying to disperse. So in the Santa Monica's, as I said, there's a lot of what we call frustrated dispersal, where animals are having trouble getting in and out, or in particular getting out. And so, but sometimes we see these young males that, we can't interview them, unfortunately, right? So we don't know exactly what they're thinking, but it seems like they're trying to disperse to get somewhere else. And so they end up bumping up against developed areas. So like that young male that was killed in Santa Monica, after it ended up near the promenade, that was a young male. And sometimes it's young animals that end up in these more urban places. And so we often think that that's probably because they're trying to disperse and they're just running up against these barriers. So.
Okay. Let's see. Now I've got a couple more questions. There's a large underpass that goes under the 101 freeway near Las Virgenes Road.
Mm-hmm.
Would a structure like that be a good crossing if it were better located with natural habitats on both sides?
Yes, absolutely. The short answer to that question is yes. And actually, we have just started monitoring that crossing. So we actually had a graduate student at Cal State Northridge 20 years ago that monitored that crossing. And actually, we're just putting out cameras right now to monitor a bunch of different crossing points, basically from like Canaan Road in the west over to Moreau Road Bridge in the east, because there's just a few different sort of places like that we just haven't gotten good information on. But yeah, the problem with that one is south of the freeway, right? I mean, right next to the stream is pretty nice, but it's right through development there. So, you know, you have Safeway and the Starbucks and et cetera on the one side and development on the other side. And then it goes a long way where, you know, there's decent habitat right next to the stream, but it's basically very intensely developed right up to that stream corridor for quite a ways to the south. And so unfortunately, yeah, I mean, that's the critical thing I didn't get a chance to mention, but you can have all the crossings that you want, right? But if you haven't preserved the habitat on both sides, they're not gonna do that much good, right? And so that's one of the major challenges. You know, that's why we're especially focused on that area, because that's essentially the last place. I mean, the Conejo Grade is another place, but that's not as well connected once you're north of the freeway. But the Liberty Canyon area and sort of in that central Santa Monica's is basically the last place where you have natural habitat up to the freeway on both sides. And so that's a critical thing. But yeah, that's a good question. The answer is that is an excellent crossing in terms of straight up getting under the freeway. And we're about to learn more about the extent to which, you know, it does get used.
So speaking of crossings, P64 appeared to be very successful in crossing.
It's true.
From the Simi Hills to Susanna Mountains. Did P64 use Rocky Peak Road, or is there a tunnel under the 118 freeway?
Right, yeah, so there is a tunnel under 118 at Corriganville, which I showed a picture of at one point. And unfortunately, we don't have, well, I guess we do now. We didn't have a camera on that crossing during the time when he was going back and forth. So we don't know for sure if he used it or not. We do know that a number of different animals have used that tunnel in the past. So P3, you know, I had that one photo of P3. He definitely used it a number of times, and we think he probably used it every time. But then we also know of other animals that have crossed or tried to cross in that area and got hit and killed on 118. We actually had this case, I didn't have time to get to it, but an adult female P39 who lived in the Santa Susannas, and we had marked 3 of her kittens. We weren't tracking them, and she got hit and killed like right in that same area, you know, so she just hadn't found it. And then actually 2 of her 3 kittens also got hit within the next sort of 2 or 3 weeks, right in that same stretch. You know, and part of the problem there, or I would say more than a part, a major problem in that spot is that there is basically no fencing, especially on the north side, that's keeping animals from getting onto the freeway, right? So, because what you want to do is you want to have a crossing, and in that area, we do have this nice crossing at Corriganville, but you want to funnel the animals to the crossing with good fencing, and basically all you have on the north side of 118 there is 4-line barbed wire fencing, which might as well just not even be there from a mountain lion's perspective. Like, that's not doing anything for a mountain lion. So actually we are working with Caltrans, and we are hoping to do a project study that area more and to actually get it good fencing there along 118 that would keep animals off the freeway and funnel them towards that good crossing. So the answer specifically about 64 is, unfortunately, we don't know for sure if he was using Corriganville or not. That spot, we have had a little bit of a trouble. Like, we put a camera around that time out there and it immediately got stolen. So we had to put one up high on inside that crossing anyway. So.
All right. I think I'm down to 2, possibly 3 questions.
Okay.
And then we'll let everybody go their way. Let's see here. Somebody, Roy asked, he photographs lions with Joanna Turner.
Yeah.
And wants to know that if you want him to send any of the scat that they find.
Oh, yeah, that would be
regularly.
great, actually. Yeah, I mean, yeah, because if they're finding much, especially in the Santa Monica's, well, or really anywhere, because we don't find it much, as I said. So, yeah, we would definitely, yeah, he could just email me or Jeff or whatever. But, yeah, we would definitely be interested to find, I mean, we'd have to sort of, we might have to check and see, you know what I mean, whether it's mountain lion for sure. But yeah, that would be great, because like I said, we very rarely find mountain lion scat, except at kill sites, like I said. And at kill sites, we kind of know what's in it because it's at a kill site, you know, so.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. The other question was, could you expand on the poaching problem, or what happened?
Yeah, so we've actually, I mean, fortunately, we've only had 2 cases where animals were killed illegally. And I don't know if this is getting into, we did have one case just a few months ago where P56 was killed on a depredation permit. So in that case, it was legal. They had a permit to do it. But we've had 2 animals that died. So P15 died a number of years ago. He was out in the west end of the Santa Monica's, and actually we lost his signal, and then we actually found him, or maybe somebody else found him and let us know. I can't remember now. But so the head and paws were gone and the collar. So we know that, that we're pretty confident that he was poached, and actually California Department of Fish and Wildlife put out a reward, and I forget how much it was, but some number of thousands of dollars, but we just never got any information on what happened there. The other case that happened though, I guess it was just last summer. So P38, who was an adult male that lived in the Santa Susanas, who also actually, interestingly, would sometimes cross 118, also potentially at Corriganville. Again, we don't know for sure. But he was actually down in the Simi Hills, and he was killed by someone at the facility there south of Simi Valley. And actually, so in that case, it was kind of suspicious because the collar was far taken and dropped far from where he was. So we had some points where he had died, and Jeff was able to find his body, but then the collar, first of all, it was cut off, right? So that was a little suspicious. And then it was far away from up this road. And so actually we contacted California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they came out right away, and they were actually able to find out who did it, and they actually got him to confess, basically. I mean, P38 had killed some livestock there that, were not being properly protected. And so this person just figured that's what they should do is, go after the mountain lion, and ended up killing him. But in that case, they were able to figure out what happened, and, and go after them. So.
Oh, that's great. That doesn't happen often with poaching.
No, it doesn't. It's true. Yeah.
Okay, last question. what info do you get when you put implants in kittens?
Right. So we're able to, I mean, basically that's the only way we're able to track them. And so because they're too small, I mean, we're thinking of trying, but in general, it's hard to collar an animal that's young and growing like that, right? And so because they're growing and their neck is growing, and so it's a little bit more challenging to put a collar, or a lot more challenging to put a collar on them. And so we were using these little implants that just go inside the body cavity, and then we actually did it with bobcat kittens as well. And people have done it with all kinds of things that are hard to put a collar on, like everything from snakes to fish to sometimes even, other carnivores that are young, and sometimes even adult carnivores if they're worried about a collar or whatever. But basically, you can track them and you can see where they go. I mean, one of the reasons why we were tracking the kittens too is really interesting to see how long did they stay with the mother. And then once they start to separate from the mother, like, do they stay together with each other? And then when they start to disperse, as I've said, dispersal of these guys is a really critical thing for us to understand, right? But also we can measure survival, right? That's a critical thing about all of this tracking of animals is there's basically no way to get an unbiased estimate of survival, and in particular of mortality causes, if you're not tracking animals, because you're just not going to find them. The only time you're ever going to find them is if they get hit by a car, basically, right? So, and so the only way to actually get a decent estimate of what's going on survival-wise and mortality cause-wise, is to track them. And so that's something else, like we've been able to, it's actually something that very few people have, is a good estimate of what are the survival rates of younger kittens, and then what are they dying for. And actually, fortunately, the survival rates are pretty good until they're about a year old, when they start to disperse, and then it's not as good, when they're subadults. But yeah, so basically from using the implants, we're able to track them, see when, where they're going, how long they're staying with their mother, et cetera, and then how long are they surviving, and if they don't, what do they die from.
Oh, great. And that's all the questions we have in our chat box. I'm sure that there are a lot more questions that people might have. And I want to, Seth, if they have more questions, do you want them to send them through me, or could they send you an email? What would be best?
Sure, yeah, that's fine. I'll just warn people that I'm, unfortunately not always the quickest at, but it's fine. It's certainly fine to email me. We're certainly always interested in if people see mountain lions. Like I said, a lot of mountain lion sightings are something else, but from this group, they're more likely to be reliable, which is great. So we're certainly always interested. But yeah, so my email is similar, right, to everyone's at the park, but it's just Seth_Riley@nps.gov. So yeah.
Also, Seth, is that website still active, the Urban Carnivores website, with all the information as well?
That's a good question. I mean, the park website has a bunch of information on the mountain lions and other projects as well. So that's probably the Urban Carnivores website has not been getting updated as much. That was started by a former grad student, and then now she's like in South Africa and doing other things. So it's just not very updated. But the parks website would be the best place for more recent stuff. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
And yeah, I saw a question. We could totally, as I said, do something about bobcats another time. That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. We'll try to set that up at for a later session.
Yeah. Sounds good.
So our next session is with Dawn, who is going to be, hey Dawn, who is going to be talking about peregrine falcons.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, down in the Cabrillo area.
Awesome.
And After that, Katie's going to be talking about red-legged frogs.
Cool. Yeah.
So we've got some really great talks coming up behind yours. So thank you so much, Seth. I know you've been super busy and out in the field a lot and have a lot on your plate, but I know from the comments I'm seeing people really appreciated you taking time to talk to them about mountain lions, and it looks like a lot of people have learned a lot of stuff that they can now go out once they're back in the parks and share with the public. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for all they do for the park and for volunteering for the parks.
Thanks, Seth.
Great.
Thank you, Seth.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Seth.
Seth.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
Have a great
you.
day, everyone.
All right. You too, everyone.
Good to see you all.